He stands at the fence on an October morning in 1886, one hand resting on the top rail, watching the wheat move. It moves the way good wheat moves, not frantically, not in the desperate shuddering of a crop fighting the wind, but in long, easy rolls, the way a calm body of water answers a stone dropped gently at its center. The heads are full. The color is the deep, settled gold of something that has taken its time, and the smell that rises from the half-acre is warm and faintly sweet, the smell of grain that means something, that means flour and bread and a winter approached without the particular dread he has carried for 2 years running. He does not smile right away. He only watches and breathes and lets the watching be enough for now. A meadowlark calls from the fence post at the far corner. 2 clean notes and then silence, as if even the birds understand that this particular morning does not require much adding to. 2 years before this morning, in the early weeks of April 1884, he stood in almost this same spot and felt something close to the opposite of what he feels now. The ground before him was white. Not the white of late snow, though there had been snow, and it had gone. This whiteness was dry and mineral, a pale crust laid over the soil, the way a thin skin of ash settles over a dead fire, undisturbed, faintly luminous in the flat spring light, and final-looking, in a way that made a man's chest go tight. He crouched down and pressed 2 fingers against it. The crust did not give. It chalked his fingertips and left them smelling faintly of salt and something older, something geological, as though the earth here had turned its back on growing things entirely and decided to become something else. The half-acre had been fine the year before, or fine enough, not rich, but workable. Then the irrigation channel, too, claims to the north, had been poorly redirected by a neighbor who meant well and understood water less than he believed he did. The overflow had sheeted across the low ground for most of a wet autumn, sitting and evaporating and sitting again, and when it finally withdrew, it left behind what standing alkali water always leaves, its minerals, pressed into the surface like a signature. The soil beneath the crust was gray and tight-poured, reluctant as old clay. He stood up and looked at it for a long time. He was a man who had spent 11 years working mill lumber, measuring, joining, building things from raw material that resisted and splintered and refused until the right approach was found. He knew how to look at a problem without flinching from it, but he also knew when a problem was beyond the tools he had at hand, and this half-acre, white and silent under the April sky, felt very much like the latter. He walked back to the cabin. His wife was inside, and she had already been looking at something. He could tell by the way she turned from the shelf above the fireplace as he came through the door, a small tin box open in her hands, her expression caught between doubt and the earliest, most fragile shape of an idea. She set the tin box on the table between them as though she were setting down something that needed to be handled carefully. Not fragile exactly, but considered. The lid had the particular resistance of a thing opened infrequently, and when it gave, it released a faint smell of old paper and the cedar shavings her grandmother had packed around the notes to protect them from damp. 3 pages, folded twice, the pencil gone silver with age in places, the handwriting small and deliberate, in the way of a woman who had grown up, when paper was something you did not waste. She unfolded them on the table and smoothed the creases with the back of her hand, and he came to stand beside her, close enough to read, but quiet enough to let her lead. She read aloud, slowly. Her grandmother had kept the notes from a bottomland farm in southern Illinois, ground that had flooded one season too many, and come back salt-sick and unworkable. The old woman had written about watching the wild onions that grew at the water's edge, how they persisted where nothing else would, how their roots went down through the crust, how, when they died back in autumn, the ground around them seemed to loosen and darken. She had written, planted them in rows on the worst quarter-acre in May, lost 2 seasons' work to them. 3rd season, the corn came in true. She had not been entirely sure why it worked. She had written that with honesty, but she had written that it had. He was quiet for a moment after. She did not fill the silence, having learned over their years together that he needed it. That silence was where he measured things, the way he had once measured mill lumber by eye before ever reaching for a rule. He said, finally, that he'd not heard of such a thing. She said she had neither, until now. He asked whether her grandmother had been a woman given to fanciful thinking. She looked at him with the particular patience she reserved for questions she felt answered themselves. He picked up the page and read the passage again, alone, then set it down. The wild onions, she explained, were already growing along the creek bank not a quarter-mile from where they stood. She had noticed them last spring, noticed the particular smell when she'd walked that way in mud season, the low, flat leaves pressing close to the ground. Deep-rooted, she thought, stubborn, the kind of plant that did not ask permission of the soil it grew in. They went that afternoon, before the light shifted too far west. The walk to the creek was soft underfoot, the last of the snowmelt still working through the ground, and the air had that particular cool sharpness of a Wyoming April that never quite made up its mind. She spotted them first, low clusters along the bank, the narrow leaves just showing, already carrying their faint, declarative smell. He crouched and pulled one free, turned it in his fingers. The bulb was small, dense, white at the root end. He pressed his thumbnail into it, and the smell intensified immediately, pungent and alive. He stood up and looked at the creek, then looked at her. She was already looking back toward the field. They went back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. She brought the 2 burlap sacks folded under her arm, and he brought his hands, which was enough. The work was simple in the way that slow, necessary work always is. Crouch, find the cluster, work the fingers down into the soft creek bank soil, ease the bulb free without tearing the root. Some came easily, some held on as though they had private business with the ground and resented the interruption. By the end of the first morning, the smell of them was deep in both sets of hands, that sharp, living pungency that stayed even after washing, that followed them back to the cabin and into the evening. He did not mind it. She did not either, though she noted it plainly, the way she noted most things, without complaint, without embellishment. The first sack filled slowly. The bulbs nestled in against each other, small and pale and dense. She worked methodically, moving along the bank in one direction, while he worked back toward her from the other end. And sometimes they were close enough to talk, and sometimes they were far enough apart that the only sound was the creek running under the last of the snowmelt and the occasional shift of a red-winged blackbird in the cattails. The second sack took 2 more mornings. They were not in a hurry exactly, but they were not careless either. They harvested what was ready and left the rest to go on growing. Each evening, after supper, he sat near the fireplace with a length of ash wood across his knees. He had found a branch the right thickness along the fence line, straight-grained, dense, the kind of wood that held a point without splitting. He worked it with his smallest carving knife, slow passes, turning the piece in the firelight after each stroke to check the taper. She would sit nearby, sometimes reading, sometimes mending, sometimes simply watching the fire, and they would talk. Not urgently, the way people talk when the day has already spent its urgency, and what remains is simply the pleasure of the other person's company. He asked her once, in the middle of the second evening, what she thought the field would look like if it worked, if the onions did what her grandmother's notes said they ought to do. She thought about it for a moment before answering. Dark, she said finally. Dark and loose, the kind of dirt that falls off the back of a shovel clean. He turned the dibber in the firelight, checking the point. That's what good ground looks like, he said. She said yes, she knew that. She was describing what they did not yet have. He was quiet a moment. Then he said he believed they would have it. She did not say anything to that, but she did not look away from him either, and in the particular grammar of that kind of silence, between two people who have made a hard place their home together, that was its own kind of answer. By the third morning, both sacks were full. The dibber was finished, smooth-handled, precisely tapered, smelling faintly of ash and wood smoke. He held it up, and she turned it once in her hands. The morning they carried the sacks out to the half-acre, the sky was the pale, washed color of old linen, and the air had that particular sharpness that comes to high Wyoming prairie in early spring. Not quite cold enough to see your breath, but cold enough to feel it moving in your chest. The ground was still firm underfoot, where the frost had not yet fully released, but the white alkali crust along the surface caught the flat light and gave the field the look of something long abandoned, something the earth itself had given up on. She went first, walking one of the longer rows, setting her pace. He came behind with the dibber, pressing each hole 3 inches down with 2 careful pushes of his wrist. No more, no less. The way she had asked him to do it. Because the notes said, depth mattered more than spacing, and spacing mattered more than almost anything else. She pressed each small bulb into its hole with her thumb, firmed the soil over it with 2 fingers, and moved on. The smell rose immediately. It was not a gentle smell. It was bright and sharp and faintly sulphurous, the kind of smell that announces itself and does not apologize. The crushed outer skins of the onions, where their gloves had bruised them slightly in the handling, gave off the strongest of it, and by the time they had finished the first 2 rows, the whole quarter of the field smelled of wild onion in a way that could not be ignored. They were working through the 5th row when they heard the horse. The western neighbor was riding the fence line, as he sometimes did in spring when he was checking for washout damage along the low ground. He slowed his horse when the smell reached him, and she saw him lift his head the way a man does when something surprises him. He pulled up entirely when he saw what they were doing, both of them kneeling in that white, sorry-looking dirt, pressing small pungent bulbs into rows with a carved wooden tool, moving like people who had thought about exactly this for a long time. He did not call out right away. For a moment he only watched. Then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly, more the laugh of someone who genuinely cannot help it, who finds the scene in front of him so strange that laughter is the only honest response he has available. He said something about the smell carrying all the way to his fence post, and something after that about good labor being a terrible thing to waste on ground that was already dead, and he shook his head, the way a man shakes his head at something he has decided is not worth arguing with. She did not look up from the row. He did not look up from the row. The dibber pressed down, came up. Her thumb pressed the bulb in. The soil closed over it. The neighbor's horse shifted, and then the sound of hooves moved on down the fence line and faded into the dry grass. The smell hung where it was. The prairie wind moved through it slowly, the way it moves through everything on high ground, patient and indifferent and without memory. They kept working. 2 years is a long time to hold something in memory, and longer still to hold it in the body, in the back, in the hands, in the particular ache that lives behind the knees after a full morning on uncertain ground. But memory, she had found, did not always weaken with distance. Sometimes it sharpened. Sometimes it became precise in the way that only things earned through patience and uncertainty ever become precise. It was late August of 1886 when she knelt at the edge of that half-acre, for the first time in a season, with something other than worry pulling her down to the ground. She went to one knee, the way she always did, and pressed her fingers into the soil along the outermost row, the row she had started herself 2 springs ago, with the dibber laid beside her and the tin box still in the cabin above the fireplace where it always was. She pressed her fingers in, and the soil came apart in her hand. That was what stopped her. Not the color, though the color was remarkable. A dark, crumbling brown, where the white crust had been. A depth of shade, that prairie soil earns slowly and only with great difficulty. It was the feel of it. It gave way under her fingers the way good earth is supposed to give way, the way soil that has held moisture and broken open and breathed and settled over 2 long seasons finally consents to yield to a hand. It was not resistant. It was not packed white and close and hostile the way it had been. It crumbled and fell back and left a small, honest darkness on her palm. She stayed there a moment, the crumble of it still in her fingers, the smell of warm earth rising in that particular way. It rises on a late summer afternoon, when the sun has been working on the ground since morning. Behind her, the sound of the mule shifting weight in the small barn, the hens moving through the dry grass at the fence edge, the ordinary sounds of their claim, which had always gone on regardless, whether the soil was dying or beginning, whether the neighbors were riding past or not. She went back to the cabin and took the tin box from the shelf. She had not opened it since the second spring, since the second planting, when she had read through the 3 pages once more, to be certain she had understood the sequence correctly. Now she sat in the south-facing light of the window and laid the pages flat on her knee. The pencil handwriting was familiar to her, in the way a voice becomes familiar. The loops and hesitations of her grandmother's hand, something she could follow as easily as spoken words. But the words themselves were different now, not changed. The same words they had always been, but different in the way that meaning sometimes waits behind language until the reader has lived enough to find it. Her grandmother had written about the roots pulling. That was the phrase she had used. The roots pulling. And at the first reading it had seemed like the kind of soft, imprecise language older women sometimes used when they meant something they could not quite measure. Now she understood it was the most accurate description available. The roots had pulled. The salt had followed. The ground had let it go. She read all 3 pages through, slowly, to the end. She set the pages back into the tin box and closed the lid. Through the south window, the late afternoon light lay across the field in long amber strips, and she watched it for a moment before she understood that she was not looking at the field, as it was now, in 1886, but as it had been then, in that first summer, when the rows smelled of something sharp and unwelcome, and the neighbor's wheat stood green and confident to the west. That summer had a particular quality of silence to it, not the silence of rest, but the silence of waiting, which is a different thing altogether. He had gone out each morning to walk the rows, crouching at intervals to press 2 fingers into the earth beside the planted bulbs, reading the soil the way a careful man reads handwriting he is not entirely certain of. The crust was still white in places, still powdery when the sun dried it, and there were stretches of the half-acre where nothing seemed to be happening at all. The northern neighbor had met them at the creek crossing in late June, when she had gone down with the bucket, and he had come along to check the bank where they harvested the onion bulbs in spring. The neighbor was a broad man who worked hard and was not unkind, but he had been farming this valley for 3 years longer than they had, and he carried that fact with him in the way he stood. He looked at the field from across the creek, at the low, dark-leafed rows that sent their bitterness out on the warm air, and he told them plainly that they had wasted a season. He was not cruel about it. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes to be true and feels some obligation to deliver. He said the ground was spent, that everyone in the valley knew the alkali patch was spent, and that bitter weeds would not change what minerals had taken a decade to ruin. She had thanked him for his concern. She had kept her voice even. That night, sitting at the table with the lamp between them while he repaired a tool handle with a length of rawhide, she had not said anything about what the neighbor had told them. Neither had he, for a while. Then he had looked up from the work and said, simply, that the roots were still pulling. It was the phrase from the tin box, from the 3 pages, her grandmother's phrase, and he had said it the way she had read it, as a fact, not a comfort. The western neighbor's wheat came in that July, at nearly 30 bushels to the acre. She had stood at the fence and watched the cutting with something she could not have named precisely. Not envy, because she understood the seasons differently than envy allows, but a kind of acute awareness of the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. Beneath the half-acre's white and ragged surface, in the darkness where no one could observe or measure or pass judgment, the deep roots of the wild prairie onions were drawing upward what the flooded channel had left behind. The salt was moving. The ground did not announce it. Winter arrived in the high prairie valley the way it always did, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of smaller surrenders. The grass went first, then the color, then the warmth at midday, and finally the light itself shortened, until the south-facing window gave them only a few pale hours of sun, before the shadow of the ridge reclaimed the yard. She filled the root cellar with what they had: dried beans, 3 sacks of meal, a crock of salt pork, the last of the kitchen garden's turnips bundled in straw, and 2 small jars of wild plum preserve she had put up in September. He banked the cabin walls with cut sod blocks against the wind, checked the chinking between the timbers, and reinforced the barn corner where the mule had rubbed the wood soft over summer. They moved into the smaller, quieter rhythm that winter demanded. The half-acre lay under snow for most of December and January. There was nothing to observe there, nothing to tend. The onion rows were invisible beneath 4 inches of crust, and if anyone had ridden past, the western neighbor returning from Laramie, or the family to the north hauling wood, they would have seen only the same blank field they had always dismissed. She thought about those buried rows sometimes in the evenings when the lamp was low and the fire had settled to coals. She thought about what her grandmother's notes had said in the second page, the part written in a smaller, more careful hand than the rest, that the roots do not rest in winter the way the eye assumes. They are still adjusting, the note said, still at work in the cold dark. When the thaw came in late February, it came quickly. 2 warm days riding in on a south wind, unusual enough that he remarked on it at breakfast, and by mid-morning, the snow on the half-acre had gone from white to gray to a thin, transparent sheet of melt running across the surface. He went out to check the barn gutter and stood afterward looking at the field. He stood there long enough that she noticed from the window and came outside with her shawl pulled close. The water was sinking. Not all of it, and not fast, but where in the 2 previous springs the snow melt had sheeted off the alkali-hardened surface and run away in a thin, glassy film toward the low ground at the field's edge, now it was disappearing into the soil. Slowly, unevenly, more in the rows than between them, but sinking. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the earth, between 2 onion rows, and felt the cold water move past his fingers rather than pool against them. He stood up. He looked at her. She had seen it too. He went inside without speaking and took the pencil from the shelf beside the tin box. On the cabin wall beside the door, at shoulder height, he made a small mark, a single horizontal line, and beside it wrote the date and 4 words in his careful mill carpenter's hand. Water gone in, February. She read it when she came back inside. She touched the words once with her fingertip, then set about warming the midday meal. Outside, the melt continued its patient, wordless work. By the time the last frost broke in early April of that second spring, the onion tops had done what green things do when the cold finally takes them. They had lain down slowly, yellowed at the tips, darkened at the stem, and collapsed against the earth, in long, irregular rows, like rows of sleeping things. She had watched the process through the south-facing window across several weeks of February and March, noting each stage without hurrying it. He had asked once, in late March, whether they ought to pull the dead tops clear, and she had shaken her head. Let them rot where they fell, she said. That was the point of them. So they waited through the last cold weeks while the dead onion leaves blackened and softened and pressed themselves flat against the soil, and the slow work of decay, The same patient chemistry that had been breaking the alkali's grip from below continued now from above. When she finally said the ground was ready, he brought the hand spade from the barn. It was a plain tool, nothing remarkable. A narrow iron blade with a worn ash handle, the kind a man keeps sharp from habit rather than urgency. He worked one row at a time, pressing the blade in at an angle and turning each spade depth of earth over completely, burying the blackened leaf material beneath fresh soil and exposing the layer below to air. She followed behind him, crouching to break apart the larger clods with her hands, working the decayed matter through with her fingers until it was distributed evenly rather than lying in clumps. They were 2 hours into the work when she stopped. He noticed and turned. She was kneeling between 2 turned rows with both palms flat on the earth, her eyes closed in a way that he had learned to read not as distress, but as attention, the concentrated kind, the kind she used when she was listening for something. He waited. She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Smell it," she said. He crouched beside her and pressed his own hand into the turned soil and brought it close. And there it was, not the sharp mineral bite that had defined that half-acre since the day they first dug into it, not the faint, acrid edge that had clung to every spade depth for the whole of the previous spring. Something different, something darker and quieter and alive, the smell of soil that had something in it rather than something wrong with it. He held his hand there longer than necessary. They did not speak for a moment. Then he stood and went back to the spade, and she went back to breaking the clods, and they finished the turning by mid-afternoon without ceremony. The second planting of bulbs went in before sundown. The same small prairie onions from the creek bank, harvested that morning, pressed 3 inches deep with the ash dibber along the same parallel rows, 1 hand width apart. The soil took them differently this time. Easier, less resistance at the blade, less of that fine white powder drifting up when the earth was disturbed. The ground was beginning to remember what it was supposed to be. The summer of 1886 was not cruel in the way that a drought is cruel, sudden and undeniable. It was quiet in its damage. The grasses along the creek browned a week earlier than usual. The mornings cooled faster, and anyone who walked the fields to the west and north of their claim and pressed a hand into the turned rows would have found something familiar to anyone who had known that half-acre 2 years before. That faint white residue on the palm, that mineral sharpness, the way the top inch of soil dried to a pale crust by mid-morning, no matter how well it had been watered the evening before. The alkali had not stayed put. That was the thing no one had considered, because no one had thought much about where it came from in the first place. It had arrived through the water table, carried in by the old diverted channel, distributed slowly and invisibly beneath the surface, and it moved the same way it had arrived, patient and without announcement, seeping westward and northward through the shared ground, until it found new fields to settle in. By August, the western neighbor's wheat was thin-stalked and pale. By late August, it was clear it would not amount to a proper harvest. He had seen the signs in July and spent 2 weeks irrigating, believing the problem was drought, and the extra water had only carried more mineral upward into the root zone. His north field, which he had planted with kitchen vegetables for his household, produced almost nothing worth keeping. He came across the fence line on a Wednesday afternoon in early September, when the light was already taking on that low amber quality that meant summer was nearly done. He walked slowly, the way a man walks when he is uncertain of his welcome. He stopped at the edge of their half-acre and stood looking at the wheat for a long moment before he spoke. He said he did not fully understand what he was looking at. She was near the cabin door when he arrived, and she came to stand at the fence on her side. She did not make it difficult for him. She listened to what he said, that his ground had gone wrong, that he did not know the name for it, that he had watched their field all season and could not account for the difference. She told him to wait, and she went inside. He stood at the fence and studied the soil, dark, crumbling at the edge where the last cultivation had turned it, holding its moisture even in the afternoon heat. Her husband came out from the barn and nodded to him, and they stood together without much conversation, the way men stand when one of them is waiting to understand something. She returned with the tin box. She lifted the lid and took out the folded pages, 3 of them, pencil written in a fine, faded hand, and she opened the first page carefully, the way you open something that has been folded a long time, and she began to read her grandmother's words aloud at the fence in the September afternoon light. She read slowly, pausing where the pencil marks had faded, filling the gaps from memory the way you fill gaps in an old song. He stood at the fence beside his wife and listened too, though he had heard those words many times now and knew their shape by heart. The neighbor did not interrupt. He listened the way a man listens when he has run out of other ideas, which is the most honest kind of listening there is. When she finished, she folded the pages along their old creases and set them back in the tin. She told him about the creek bank, a quarter-mile east, where the small, deep-rooted onions grew in clusters along the water's edge. She described the dibber. Her husband went to the barn and returned with it, the ash-wood point worn smooth now from 2 springs of use. And she explained the spacing, 1 hand width, 3 inches down, long parallel rows pressed in, while the ground was still cold. She told him it would smell. She told him the first season would look like failure. The neighbor took the dibber in both hands and turned it over once, studying it. He handed it back and said he understood, and she believed that he did. By the time the Laramie freight wagon made its September run through the valley road, there was a crate waiting by the fence post, wheat, and from the kitchen garden, dried beans in cloth sacks, 3 ropes of braided garlic, 2 paper-wrapped parcels of seed. Not much by the measure of a good farm in good country. Enough by the measure of what that half-acre had been. Her husband lifted the crate onto the wagon himself. She stood beside him and watched the driver note it in his ledger, and there was a long, quiet moment between them that did not require words, the kind of moment that belongs only to people who have worked toward the same thing for a very long time. The other families came that afternoon, both of them, from the west and from the north, and the neighbor from the fence the day before, and 2 more she did not recognize, from farther up the valley. They stood in a loose gathering along the fence line and studied the dark, crumbling earth on the other side of it, the soil that had been white and salt-crusted, and mocking in its uselessness not 2 years before. Some of them crouched down and touched it. One woman asked how deep the change had gone. Her husband took a spade and turned a clean column of earth at the fence edge to show them, dark all the way through, holding together in good cohesive clumps, smelling of nothing but soil. She had gathered what she could from the creek bank that spring, more than they needed for their own rows. She had dried the extra bulbs in the root cellar and kept them in a lidded crock. She brought the crock out now and set it on the fence post and told anyone who wanted them to take what they could carry. They stood there together in the late summer light, on soil they had patient loved back to life, and gave away everything they had left to give.